and welcome. Well, it's that time again, and in a previous episode we touched on crossing water obstacles, primarily amphibious landing on a beach, more so than river crossing. And we needed to touch on it because we had to explain some of the background and logic around the TOG Amphibian for those episodes. In this episode, we're going to step away from TOG matters and go a little further into wading and waterproofing. So if you recall, we determined 3 routes to get ashore. The first was crossing the water as a boat. Now this is whether as a boatified tank with floats or a DD system, or even a tankified boat. The latter method, when we come to look at trucks, is exemplified by the British Terrapin and American DUKW duck concepts. The second main way of crossing a water obstacle would be driving under the water, like the A9 concept, the TOG Amphibian, and indeed this is exactly how it's done today with even Soviet-style designs, things like the Leopard as well. Oddly, it is the more modern method, which is also perhaps why it's so unusual in 1940 when people are talking about this sort of idea that it is so decried. The A9 had already done it by this time for the British, the Tauschpanzer for the Germans, so the TOG Amphibian didn't really stand out very much in that regard, other than lacking the umbilical. Even later, of course, you've got something like the Mouse all adopted this solution. So really, I've no idea why then it's seemingly so easy for people to view the driving underwater as such a bad idea when that is in the main how it's done today. But maybe that's a deconstruction of bias we could do another day as to why people have these preconceptions, particularly about something big and heavy. The third method, of course, is wading. Now, wading entails driving through water without, hopefully, being fully submerged. To the extent that some of the vehicle is immersed in water, elements needed for cooling the engine and ventilation, primarily air, obviously, venting exhaust at times, and indeed a passage for escape are maintained. Regardless of which of those methods you adopt, there has also to be some degree of waterproofing. The vehicle might not have to be watertight, and even core components of a vehicle, such as an engine, can in fact be completely submerged in such schemes, as long as the system is sealed, and especially the electrical systems are protected from shorting out. Some other considerations for landing need to be thought out as well. So as I said, there's some other considerations. First and foremost are beach obstacles. Now in the footage you'll be able to see a landing craft being tested against an obstacle called the Belgian Gate. This is a simple, passive steel framework dropped in the water, and as you can see, it's rather effective. If the landing craft cannot get up to the shore, it cannot discharge its vehicles, no matter how well waterproof they are, and so it has to retreat. That's not what you want to do under fire. Those aren't the limit of obstacles either. Those, and particularly things like concrete walls, the sort of beach wall at the end, are a particular problem. Now, explosives and demolition charges, everything from the 29mm petard mortar on the Churchill Avery, or various devices like the goat and onion charges, can demolish them. They can also be climbed with ramps, arcs, and other small bridges. The SBG, the small box girder bridge, being a classic example. Mines too have to be flailed, that is, the flail device on the front of a vehicle, whipping its way across the beach to detonate the sand, to clear a path. Even if those aren't there, if there is a patch of soft sand or very gravelly beaches, these will have to be prepared for following vehicles as well. And the way to do that is by covering them with matting. It's particularly important for wheeled vehicles. These would be things like chespulling, which is a kind of trackway made from canvas or other material reinforced with transverse sticks, essentially. There's a bigger version of that as well, like a giant bobbin on the front of a tank. And what that does is it just lays a full width mat in front of it. And all of these vehicles, from flails to girder bridges and the bobbin machines, are all covered in the work of 79th Armoured Brigade, which has been written about extensively. Nonetheless, all of those vehicles all need to also be prepared for wading in deep water, because they're probably going to be first. If not first, then they're going to be among the first vehicles coming ashore, as they need to clear a path for following ones. Now, where the waterproofing and wading part comes in is that they're going to be having to come onto the beach, they're going to have to potentially see action right away, and they're also going to have to be able to cross water as deep as it's going to be realistically able for them to manage, which is about 6 feet. Even a very well prepared medium tank like a Sherman or a Ram, 6 feet is still the realistic limit, even with raised duct work on the back and extensive sealing around the mantlet and turret ring. But, in a nutshell, obstacles need to be removed and the beach conditions improved so that following vehicles from subsequent waves can traverse them. The next element in your landing vehicles on a foreign beach is fire support. And there are 2 types to think about here: wet fire support and dry fire support. Wet fire support was the concept of tanks and self-propelled guns being landed into the foreshore and sitting in the water delivering direct fire against enemy positions over the heads of their own troops, especially in support of them attacking a beachhead area. Unturreted vehicles are particularly a problem here, as to be able to deliver fire at any reasonable angle off to one side, they'd have to turn so that more of the vehicle is facing the water, and this increases the likelihood of it being swamped. We've mentioned in a previous video that DD vehicles, those duplex drive vehicles, could go to a half drop position to do this. So a Sherman, for example, conducting this role, could sit in the water with the front half of the screen down, allowing it to fire, while the rear half remained up, protecting it from the waves. During the course of research into wading and waterproofing, I found various firing trials were actually conducted in order to ascertain the robustness of waterproofing seals and around the turret and of the fabric, particularly around the gun mantlet. Because the blast and shockwave from firing during this support phase could leave the vehicle liable to leakage, and honestly some of the tests were not very successful. But we have that option for wet fire support. The second type of fire support is dry fire support. Namely, the vehicles conducting the fire mission will be sat in the landing craft facing the shore. Thus, they would be spared the issue of waves coming at them from behind, but would suffer from the movement of the craft on which they were sat, and also from a limited range of fire. Now, obviously, unturreted vehicles will be highly restricted in this scenario, because there's not enough room on the landing craft to turn. But so too, in actuality, were also turreted ones, as neither type of vehicle was able to fire over the raised horns on the front of a landing craft. Both vehicles would also have to wade ashore eventually anyway, potentially now with broken waterproofing seals, and this would be additionally complicated as the goal was to have 2 such vehicles abreast in a craft to maximise the firepower which could be delivered, thus complicating the whole unloading procedure. Clearances, in particular for vehicles, especially when we think back to those funnies, were extremely tight, and even incidental contact on leaving the landing craft could tear off sections of waterproofing material, leaving the vehicle either stranded in the mouth of the craft, or worse still, stalled at the bottom of it. A word of note here is also just how difficult it was, as some of the test results show a margin of just a couple of inches either side of some of these vehicles, particularly those funnies. Now, so picture the vessel moving with the waves and the action of the enemy, you're buttoned down in the tank, trying to drive it carefully out of the ramp without touching the sides, and you've only got a couple of inches of spare room. That is a difficult task. It is further complicated by the angle of the ramp into the water, the drop angle. If this angle is too steep, then even trying to unload your vehicle into 4 feet of water might easily swamp the truck or tank because the water level will come too high. So, extensions called Mulock extensions were added to the front of landing craft to reduce the steepness of the angle. This was particularly important when it eventually came to unloading things like the 17-pounder, so that it wouldn't strike the ramp on the way out. But it also applies to tow hooks on the backs of vehicles as well. Even so, once you park your landing craft with a Mulock extension on the foreshore, now you've got the potential of a thing called scour. As water travels back and forth during the movement of the sea, you can create a pocket in front of the landing craft deeper than the depth at which you had originally landed. Thus, a craft landing on a beach at 4 feet might, in the course of being sat there, create a scoured pocket 6 feet deep. So your 4-foot prepped vehicle might become trapped. As an additional nightmare during a second or subsequent wave of landing craft, they would have no idea where these pockets might exist. So there's a good likelihood of even a properly prepared vehicle becoming trapped. So, getting ashore means a drive through the water of your craft, then up the beach and onto the land and behind, through some convenient gap or cleared path or bridge. But then what? Now we're ashore, what do we do now? We want our tank in particular fighting fit, ready for action, but it's got all this waterproofing kit on it. So we've got a couple of things here to help us. One is a material called Cortex, and the other are cables. Cables are used to release the kits, the big ductwork on the back especially, so they will hopefully fall off. Cortex, however, is a type of explosive cord basically glued to the vehicle in areas such as the mantlet, and then the waterproofing fabric fastened over it. The fabric keeps the water out, but also impeded the operation of the tank. So rather than have men exit the vehicle once you're ashore to cut it off, you would simply detonate the Cortex to blow away this fabric. If both the cables to release the ductwork worked and the Cortex blew off the fabric, a combat vehicle like a tank could come ashore, clear the kit, fight, and then move and remove the remnants of the waterproofing equipment later. If, however, it did not operate properly, then the ducting might have to be bashed off by rotating the turret. And during at least one trial, a kit was so firmly glued onto the back of the tank that even the barrel hitting it would not knock it off. If, of course, the canvas screen did not get cleared by the Cortex, there were few alternatives other than to continue to fight seriously diminished or to get out and cut it away manually. For other things like the sealants around the bolts and hatches and seams, these would have to be cleaned off by hand at a later date and were quite difficult. There was an account of a Churchill at Dieppe having to have material around the side hatch cut away so the chap inside could get out. Now, whether that's true or not doesn't really matter in terms of that anecdote illustrates that these materials were very difficult to remove. Vehicles, additionally, such as carriers and self-propelled guns coming into a shore, perhaps not directly into combat, were often fitted with another device called an extension panel. And these simply raised the level at which water could enter them. Gaps between the extension panel and the original vehicle, gaps between the extension panels, these would all have to be sealed as well. And if you picture something like an M7 self-propelled gun, fabric was then fastened over the complicated areas, particularly around the gun. The whole idea of these extension panels was that once ashore, the vehicles would drive a relatively short distance into the beachhead. They would go to what's called a de-waterproofing area. They'd remove all of this kit for later salvage. Quite how useful this second-hand kit is debatable. Personally, I think it's going to be useless because During testing, even slight damage to these kits created leaks and a bit of a nightmare, honestly. So recovery of these kits is more about salvage, mostly of large amounts of mild steel. If, however, one looks carefully at some period footage, you can often see vehicles, even prior to getting to the dewaterproofing area, the crews have already started to remove some of these panels and get rid of them, for the sheer inconvenience they pose to both fighting, visibility, and, more importantly, driving. Let's quickly go over the materials of waterproofing. So we've got Cortex, that's the explosive cord material. During the footage you'll have watched, you'll have seen a ram tank coming ashore with Canadian forces during training, an explosion on the front of it that was demonstrating the detonation of the Cortex. We've seen various vehicles with extension panels to raise the water entry height. We've seen the duct work as well on the back of tanks, that raised cowling for the air intake so that coolant air could still be sucked into the engine. And we've seen fabric. This is balloon fabric or Admiralty D cloth especially, covering complex areas. On a big vehicle like a truck, it's simply covering the radiator to stop that surge of water coming up and swamping the engine and electrics, and on self-propelled guns and tanks around the complex area around the gun. Especially, those will be glued in place with materials like Bostik. Then, sealing gaps and bolt holes, that was the job of materials like asbestos compound and WDPP, that's War Department pressure plastic. So these are very plastic, they're very malleable materials, they're easily manipulated to fill gaps, but they are kind of disgusting materials to use and also a pain to remove later. And the whole goal of this, remember, was to create a scheme to wade vehicles ashore. Obviously you want to wade your vehicles as little as possible. It was found to be very deleterious to their service life. You want your tank to stay as dry as possible at all times, so if you can unload it into 6 inches of water, you do that. But you also have to have a plan in case you can't. Maybe your landing is delayed and you're going to be unloading it into 6 feet of water, in which case you need to be prepared for that. And in fact, at the start of the war, the plan had only been for 3 feet. That was considered acceptable. And it was only through testing, extensive testing, that this was increased to a goal of 6 feet. And all of the work of doing all this was a lot more complicated than simply, we'll stick some panels onto it. The schemes have to be designed, they have to be fitted, they have to be tested, they have to be modified, and they have to be refitted, they have to be retested. Approval for manufacture. Manufacturing has to take place. Production controls have to be in place to ensure the quality is up to standard. Then those kits have to be fitted. They have to be trialed. And then thousands of men have to be trained in fitting and then removing this equipment. So all of that was done, and obviously the emphasis was on the major landing for something like D-Day. And rapidly after D-Day, it seems that work slowed down. The schemes had proven more effective than they could possibly really have imagined, and the landings had gone off almost without a hitch, to the point where the schemes didn't need much more developing. They clearly had adequate schemes in hand. So after D-Day, the work really slowed down, and a switch in the attention went to the Far East, and in a couple of months that too petered out. So in my new book on wading and waterproofing called Striding Ashore, I go over all of this development work in detail and the reasoning behind the various steps taking place in the UK for both wading and waterproofing. And we go over everything from vehicles like the diminutive Universal Carrier up to including some of the late war projects, even when they come into like Comet, Tortoise and Centurion ideas are mentioned right at the end there. And I'm really hoping that this book is going to help fill a gap more than just the, we use DD tanks on D-Day. Well, yeah, there were some DD tanks on D-Day, but there weren't many, and they didn't do a great deal. The majority of effort was wading and waterproofing of vehicles, and it has, to date, garnered very little attention. So I'm genuinely hoping this book is going to fill a much needed gap in people's knowledge of the work that has taken place and the amount of effort that had gone in behind the scenes to make various operations like D-Day the success that they were. Well, that's it for now on wading. Hopefully you guys found that interesting. I'm going to put together all of the footage that I have on various wading and waterproofing elements and activities, stick it all together, probably without any commentary, just as a follow-on video, and that'll link back to this one. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you found that interesting, and I hope my book, when it comes out, will be equally engaging and interesting for you. In the meantime, if you need some recommended reading, I would recommend this book. So, on a similar vein to waterproofing, is the not very well known British investigation into Zimmerit. So, if you don't know what Zimmerit is, it's that waffly textured pattern on German tanks. The British first encountered it in 1944, and it was a bit of a puzzle for them. They grew to like it, saw some potential with it, and spent several years investigating and improving on the recipe. So, and that book there, I will put a link to where you can order that in the chat below. If you want to get a primer on what we're going to talk about in a later video, because I'll be going over the Zimmerit work in a later one, then please do order that book. Thank you very much. And again, you can continue to support this channel. And links to all the other videos are also available. Thank you very much for your time. Have a good night.